So today I'm going to talk about the facial expression of emotion. We've learned a little bit more about how emotions are felt and experienced. And so I'm going to discuss a little bit about the facial expression of emotion. So human facial expressions are really tremendous. They can convey lots of different social messages. So for example, we use facial expressions in conversation to show doubt or reluctance. And they can also betray our personality if we are extroverted or shy. But of course, we've come here to talk about emotions, and we know that facial expressions are used often to communicate emotions such as basic emotions, happy, sad, angry, but a lot of other more complex emotions like delighted, irritated, contempt, embarrassed, excited, etc. And the reason why the human face can convey all of these different social messages is because it's very complex. It's got all of these individual facial muscles, which are called action units, which can be combined together in different ways to create many, many, many different dynamic, complex patterns. So in principle, for every dynamic pattern it can create, it can communicate a different social message. So the human face has this tremendous capacity to generate different complex signals and therefore lots of different social messages. Now, this then makes studying facial expressions really, really challenging. Now, we might not think so much about that because when we use our facial expressions, when we perceive facial expressions, it's all very easy. We do this all day, every day, and it's all very easy. But empirically, it's very, very challenging because there's a lot to sift through there. And I really like this quote here from 1947, and that is, in the languages of gesture all over the world, there are varying mixtures of the physiologically conditioned response. So here they're referring to what's cross-cultural in facial expressions and the purely cultural one. So that's what's culture specific. And it is frequently difficult to analyze out and segregate the two. So this is as true now as it was then. It's very difficult to study facial expressions because essentially there are so many of them. Now, in approaching this question of which facial expressions communicate which emotions, what is the form and function of facial expressions, many of you will be familiar with the sort of pioneering work, of course, of Darwin and many others that followed him in testing which facial expressions communicate which emotions. So these 6 facial expressions that you see here, many of you will be familiar with, and this was for a long time the gold standard. These 6 universal facial expressions of emotion, which Ekman and others used. They hand-selected these images. They essentially hypothesized that these particular patterns, facial patterns, would be recognized as these different emotions in a lot of different cultures. And their classic work where they took pictures of these facial expressions, showed them to people in different cultures, they then reported that they were easily recognized. Now, the reason why they did this, of course, is, showing pictures to people and asking them to recognize them was because Darwin in particular had noted the very close relationship between production and perception. So if you recognize a signal as X, it's likely then that that signal is produced and communicates X in your culture. So they were using perception to understand which facial expressions are produced to communicate different emotions. Now, if we take a closer look at this data, this classic data, we can actually see that rather than the facial expressions being universally recognized, there's a lot of cross-cultural variation. So these points here, these color-coded points, represent the average recognition accuracy for each of the 6 different facial expressions: happy, surprise, fear, disgust, anger, and sad, across different world regions. And those outlined in black are 75% accuracy or below. I've chosen this 75% accuracy as a kind of reasonable level of what would be considered typical accuracy. Oftentimes in studies, chance performance is used, but in a 6 AFC task such as this, chance performance is something like 16%, which is, so most of the time you're getting it wrong. So that's a pretty low bar. So here we've chosen one that's a bit more realistic. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of variation then across cultures with respect to these particular facial expressions. So that means, if these facial expressions are not really recognized very well across cultures and they're better recognized in Western cultures, which facial expressions then communicate these different emotions? So that was the question that this raised really in the end. Now, if we also think a little bit about the methodological approach they took, and to be frank, they didn't really have much of a choice other than to hand select images of faces they believed would communicate emotions in different cultures, is that there was a kind of compound sampling bias, if you like. So if you think about all of the different facial expressions the human face can make, which we showed at the beginning, there's many, many of them, hundreds of thousands possibly. Now they looked only at emotions, which was fine. That was the research question, but they only focused on 6 basic emotions, which when we know that there are many, many more emotions out there. They're also static images, and they were selected by Westerners. And this was based on their own observations, primarily of their own environment. So it stands to reason, of course, that the images that they chose as being representative were recognized in Western culture, but then turned out they were not recognized in other cultures. But this approach of hand selecting images of a small set of emotions means that the full range of facial expressions have not been tested. And at that time, of course, there was no way that they could have tested all possible facial behaviors anyway. So now we have, of course, many more technological and methodological developments that will allow us to explore the full range of facial expressions, different combinations of these action units, and also their features of their temporal parameters, such as amplitude or when in time different action units are activated. Now, when I talk about new technologies, I'm going to show you a new technology that we've developed in Glasgow, and this is combined with very classic methods of reverse correlation. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how this method works. And before I do, I want to point out that reverse correlation is not new. It's very old, in fact. So if we go back even to the kind of 30s and late 50s, this was used by Volterra and Wiener. So this is a technique that's been used for a very long time, coming from psychophysics and engineering, where you use it to agnostically probe a system to understand it. So if you have a system and you don't know what it is, you can probe it in a kind of data-driven way and then understand how it works. Again, many of you will be familiar with the seminal work of Hubel and Wiesel, who this was a kind of accidental reverse correlation experiment, I suppose, looking at V1 cells, and in a more systematic way with Ahumada and Lovell in 71 using auditory cues. This later became adopted in more in vision science, and this became more developed, where the agnostic sampling or generation of stimulus features compared to hand-selected images was developed with different methods such as bubbles, but also using truncated noise and white noise. And what I'll show you today is these generative models of the human face. So very briefly, what is it when we're talking about this? So if we even go back to Tinbergen, so that reverse correlation and generative models have been used in ethology for a very, very long time. None of this is new, but it's new to the field of facial expressions, is being able to build a model of a feature. So here we have models of bird wingspan and shape. And so they modeled these parameters and they then varied them to understand which ground-dwelling animals would respond in fear. They would escape when they saw these particular patterns. These are those with the crosses underneath. So this is very classic work. So this is a generative model, and then you essentially use reverse correlation to figure out which wing shapes would these ground-dwelling animals be afraid of. We're doing exactly the same thing. So this is classic work, classic methodology, but applied with new technologies that we've developed in Glasgow. Okay, so this is
a demo of
I don't
our
know if you can hear the sound on this.
3D faces. As you can see, they can speak.
So this is a generative model of
the features of
the human face that we've developed in Glasgow. You can see it changes shape. This is based on all the capture of real people. And also facial movements, so we can generate facial movements.
This way, we can study how facial expressions interact with speech.
We can also combine it
Hi,
with speech.
this is a demo of our generative model of dynamic 3D faces.
Okay, so I think that's,
As you
I'm
can
not sure if
see,
you can hear that,
they
but
can
that's the
speak.
summary. So essentially what we do is that rather than hand selecting images of facial expressions, we'll generate agnostically some facial expressions. So on each experimental trial, a random subset of action units are selected and combined together to create a facial animation. Because essentially what we're saying is, I don't know which facial expressions this observer in this culture is going to interpret as, say, happy or disgust. So we generate them randomly. Then the observer is asked to interpret the facial animation. And in this case, we were interested in understanding which facial expressions communicate basic emotions. So here we have the basic emotions, and the observer is asked to select an emotion only if it accurately describes the facial expression. If it doesn't, if it's kind of a bit like happy or a mixture between disgust and anger, they're asked to select other. They're only asked to choose a label if it accurately matches the facial expression. Now, they do this many, many times. Everybody's fed and water and paid and everybody's looked after, but they maybe do maybe 1,000 or 2,000 trials because we have a pretty large space to sample. So they do this on every trial. And then after the experiment, what we do is that we build the relationship between the action units that were displayed on the trial and the participants' responses. We build this statistical relationship between the two. That means that we can identify the action unit patterns that cause an emotion perception in the receiver. So this means that we're able then to derive quantitative models. So that means that we can do formal objective analyses on the facial expression patterns. Rather than having something descriptive or an image, which is much more difficult to analyze, here we have a formal quantitative model of the facial expressions that elicited these perceptions. We also derive per participant models. So we derive a model for each individual participant, for each response type. And this enables us to preserve rather than erase any individual variation. It also enables us to estimate population prevalence. So if we find an effect in N observers, we can estimate how prevalent this is in the population. It also enables us to have very, very high statistical power per model because many participants do many trials. So there's very, very high within participant statistical power. And that enables us to, again, show replication of effects across N participants. Okay, so having shown you then the method, so essentially this is a data-driven agnostic generation of facial movements and then modeling the facial movements that elicit perceptions in receivers. So we've used this to study emotions, of course. This is where it all began, looking at basic emotions and being able to then to tease apart what is culturally common and what's culture specific. And because we derive because the stimuli are dynamic, we can derive dynamic models. And that means that we can look at, for example, how action units are activated over time. We've also applied this to a lot of other social messages because there is, of course, a world outside of emotions, looking at conversational facial expressions, pain and pleasure, different types of smiles, and also facial movements associated with perceived personality traits, and also looking at more fundamental signaling, for example, multiplexing, how facial expressions of emotion are able to multiplex categories as well as dimensional information, and also looking at how facial expressions convey intensity. What we find it's actually specific action units that do this, rather than necessarily just varying the amplitude of the facial expression. So I'm aware of the time. I'm just going to whiz through some of these main results. So I'll start with the very first one, which was in 2012. So these are facial expression models we've derived from an East Asian participant on the left-hand side and a Western participant on the right-hand side. This is going to go round in a loop, and I'll go through three emotions. It'll be happy, disgust, and anger. Okay, happy, disgust, and anger. Now, what we found is that there's more variance in the eyes for the East Asian models and more variance in the mouth for the Western models. So let me show that to you. Let's start with the East Asians on the left-hand side. So we'll go round again. So we have happy, disgust, and anger. Happy, disgust, and anger. So you can see there's quite a lot of variance in there. You can definitely tell them apart, especially disgust and anger, which are already quite similar facial expressions, but even have this little jump of the eyebrows for happiness. Now let's look at the Westerners on the right-hand side. So let's go around again. We have happy, disgust, and anger. There's not a lot of variance in there. They're actually very similar, particularly for disgust and anger. So if you just looked at the eyes for disgust and anger, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. So there's not a lot of expressive variation there. Okay, we found the opposite thing when we go to the mouth. So let's switch to the mouth. Let's stick with the Westerners. Okay, yeah, the Westerners, which are on the right-hand side. So we have happy, disgust, and anger. So now you can see there's a lot more variation there, particularly between disgust and anger. Let's do again. Happy, disgust, and anger. You can see even the mouth is clenched, more clenched for the anger facial expressions. Okay, so let's now move to the East Asians, where you'll see that it's quite similar. Happy, disgust, and anger. Let's go again. Happy, disgust, and anger. So it's quite similar between disgust and anger there. So essentially what we found is that by modeling these facial expressions in a data-driven manner using cultural perceivers, is that we found that the variation in expressivity is located in different parts of the face. Okay, so that's really about the cultural differences. So let's now move to the cultural similarities, because of course we're interested in both sides of the story. Oh yes, this is also to say that the results we found here very much mirror the emoticons that are found in Eastern and Western culture. For example, in Eastern culture, emoticons vary according to the eyes. This is how they express the emotions, whereas in Western culture, it's usually expressed with the mouth. The eyes stay the same. So this very much mirrors what's used online. Okay, so we also wish to look at, to be able to identify what's common across cultures. So we use the same technique to model a much wider range of facial expressions, 60 facial expressions of emotion across 2 cultures. So we increased by tenfold the amount of classic studies. And then what we did is that we used a data reduction technique to identify, very similar to factor analysis, to identify the main sources of expressivity that would structure these facial expressions. And so what we found is that there are 4 main expressive patterns that subtend this wide range of facial expressions. So it's 4, this is why we called it 4, not 6. That we found that they were really 4 culturally common expressive patterns. And that means that every individual facial expression that we modeled can be expressed as one of these core patterns plus an accent. So this is an example of ecstatic. It has a core pattern with the wide eyes and an open mouth, plus an accent. And when we also looked at these core expressive patterns, we found that they mapped on very clearly to valence and arousal. For example, the expressive pattern on the left-hand side was almost exclusively associated with positive valence. The expressive pattern on the right here was much more specific in that it was almost exclusively associated with negative valence emotions, but high arousal as well. What was quite interesting is that the third pattern that you see here, the wide open eyes and mouth, which is often associated with fear, was not associated with any specific valence, but rather it was associated specifically with high arousal emotions. So this seemed to be a pattern that was able to float around to increase the arousal of the message, but it wasn't specific to positive or negative emotions. Okay, so in terms of dynamics, I'd mentioned, of course, our stimuli are dynamic, and therefore the models that we derive are dynamic. And that means that we can then look at how emotions are communicated over time in the course of a facial expression. And what we found is that, and this is with a Western group, but I'll mention briefly cross-cultural results, is that in the beginning of the signaling dynamics, the facial expressions across emotions were quite similar. So in this case, what we had were shared action units between fear and surprise, the wide eyes. But then over time, the facial expressions became more distinct. For example, here you can see specific action units. For surprise was the eyebrow raising, and for fear, it was the lateral mouth stretch. So that enabled the emotions to become distinguished. We also found the same thing for disgust and anger. I'll just show you a quick video. So in the beginning, the nose wrinkler is shared between disgust and anger. But then later in the signaling dynamics, the facial movements become more distinct, and that enables them to become distinguished. Now, a quick mention about these results. We found the same pattern with an East Asian population, but very, very interesting. What we found is that in the beginning, the action unit patterns are not only similar across some emotions, but they're also similar across cultures. But over time, they become much more distinct. So you can see here, time is on the x-axis. In the beginning, the facial movement patterns are very similar. This is like low distinctiveness. So they're very similar. And then over time, they become very distinct. And that makes them more difficult to understand across cultures. Okay, so and looking at this and being able then to really tease apart, what are these action units doing? What are they for? How do they combine together across time to communicate different emotions? We're able to inform theories of emotion communication or facial expression communication in general. And because we can derive quantitative models, that means that we can also inform the design of digital agents, because they need a recipe book. They need to know which action units to combine with what things at what time and amplitude levels and things. So we're able then to improve significantly the social signaling capabilities of virtual agents in communicating emotions, but other social messages using their facial expressions. Okay, very quickly, I'm aware of the time. So, of course, facial expressions are always on some kind of face shape and complexion. And so the method that I've just described to you is this is generating randomly facial features and asking people to interpret them. We can also apply this, of course, to face shape and complexion, because we can easily measure this. We have built a generative model for it. We can do the same thing. So essentially, we can apply this here to shape and complexion here. We can do this separately, but we can also do it together so that we can understand which face shapes and complexions correspond to different perceptions, but then how does that impact the interpretation of facial expressions? How does this combine together to give us a unified account of how faces communicate social information? Okay, so I've mentioned a little bit about how we use this method with behavior. So again, we're probing the behavioral system, the perceptual system with these randomly generated facial features. But it doesn't stop there, is that we can also use this to probe the system of the brain. Because all you need is a generative space and a response. And so we are asking people to press buttons, but you can also measure brain responses or other types of responses. And so that's exactly what we're doing now, is that we're using these generative models to probe the activity of the brain, to understand how it decodes action units, how it decodes face shape and complexion over time using MEG. We're also using this, of course, for the silicon brain. How do DNNs work? What features are they using? Is it the same as a human? And so again, we can use this in exactly the same way. We probe the system to figure out what is it doing, how is it working inside. And this is work that's led by Christoph Daub at Glasgow University. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you all also to all of our funders and collaborators. Many thanks.
Clapping. If you're happy to take questions, I'll run the microphone around. Does anyone have any questions for Rachel? I think everyone is really hungry. Well, since you've saved us a little bit of time, then we'll. Oh, wait, there's one question. Hold on. We're running a microphone back.
Yes, thank you so much for this talk. I was wondering, what do you think about research from, for example, from like Lisa Falkenberg on the question on whether emotions and also like the facial expressions are actually constructed and also acquired by learning rather than something that's innate?
Oh, yes. I think it's not an either or. I mean, that would be my guess, is that we certainly learn new patterns, new signals. And, you know, if you were to move to a different culture, you would quickly learn some of these different patterns. So I think it's less a case of an either or and more about what's the relative contribution of some of the more kind of innate skills that we have, and then the contribution of how learning really adds to the acquisition of understanding facial expression communication in terms of the development of the visual system from kind of early age. What I would really like to be able to do is to model the features of somebody before they move to a different culture, and then to see whether the features that they have acquired or understood impacts negatively or positively the learning of new features when they enter a new culture with a different signaling system.
Great, thank you very much. Looks like there are no further questions. So, oh wait, there's one on the back. Can you see right?
How do like neurodivergencies and that kind of thing affect the emotional communication, facial expressions?
Sorry, could you repeat your question? I didn't quite hear it.
Like how do neurodivergencies affect these kinds of facial expression communications and interpretations and that kind of thing? Or has that not been like researched much yet?
Were you asking about neurodiverse populations? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, like the sample size being tested, has it explored like neurodivergency variation and stuff? Or...
Yes, so the samples that we've included so far are typically developed adults. I think that's what you're asking, and across cultures. I know work that has been done using this method by Kirsty Ainsworth and Jim Tanaka on adults with ASD, and they found some really interesting results in terms of differences in the expectations, because that's really what we're studying here, are perceptual expectations of signals. And what they found is that this population had they expected the action units to be the same as typically developed adults, but the order of them was switched. And so it looked very different then. The expectations were quite different, and that made interpretation of the other groups' facial expressions quite difficult, actually, more difficult than you would think, just because of the timing. Does that answer your question?
Yes, she's nodding. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay.
Join me in thanking Rachel.